Welcome to the AFR Saints channel, where we provide you daily content on your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to leave your comments below and smash that like button. Who dat?
When you look at the New Orleans Saints offseason to this point, and look, DA was asked about it today, what he thought of the offseason to this point, mentioned he likes where they are. He said that a bunch today. I like where we are. And was asked free agency. Did you get everything you needed? Are there any musts left? It's kind of, I don't know if there's musts, but wants and needs. We'll get to some of those needs momentarily. But when you do look at the free agent period, the offseason as a whole to this point, they have made moves, and moves that on the surface absolutely look like they would benefit your team, right? And a lot of it has been adding some depth. Obviously, the biggest move is Derek Carr. We know that. We talked about Bryan Edwards, the wide receiver, being added yesterday. So when he was asked musts, no, not musts, probably addressed most of that already in free agency, but there's definitely wants and there's definitely needs. So one of the last questions he was asked actually today was about remaining positions of need, if it would be free agency or the draft, and this is what DA said about the remaining positions of need.
Probably specifically more in the defensive tackle area. I think really what we're looking for right now is how do we build some depth on the defense. We've tried to build a little bit of depth at the linebacker position. We still need to add some depth at the defensive line position. Safety's an area that we added a pretty significant amount of depth to this offseason. So we'll keep looking to see if there's anybody that pops up on our radar that we think can help us. But I think our focus has kind of moved a little bit more towards the draft.
Depth makes a lot of sense in multiple areas. You heard him talk about safety, already kind of adding some depth there, and as well as cornerback, right? You bring in Lonnie Johnson, you feel good. Okay, that's a nice depth piece there. Jonathan Abram, of course, depth piece there. Linebacker, you've done that. The thing I look at with the New Orleans Saints is I feel like really the majority of their positions, you like the front line. It's everything else that needs to kind of clean up. And not that they haven't already added. We just mentioned Lonnie Johnson and Jonathan Abram as an example. But right, you like Marshawn Lattimore and Paulson Adebo and Alontae Taylor. You like that at cornerback. You like Tyrann Mathieu and Marcus May as your starting safeties. You got to keep Marcus May a little bit more healthy than you did last season, and get those guys playing a little bit more together on the field at the same time for that to really reach the full potential. Because I don't think you necessarily saw that out of Marcus May last year. When he came in, he's still a great player. Injuries were just kind of the red flag, so to speak, and it did rear its head last season. You like Demario Davis and Pete Werner, right? Well, what can you do behind that linebacker? Zach Bond's really been a special teams piece at this point. Caden Ellis now plays in Atlanta, so you need to build depth there, as Dennis Allen was saying. The defensive line we'll get to, but even offensively, right? On paper, you love the idea of Michael Thomas and Chris Olave. You loved that idea going into last year. Well, we know what happened with Michael Thomas, and we'll get to him a little bit later on in the show. Same thing can be said, quarterback. You really like the idea of Derek Carr. Jameis Winston's behind him. I think running backs where you really address the most with adding Jamal Williams. Defensive line is still that spot for the New Orleans Saints where you look at, okay, you added pieces in Nathan Shepard and Colin Saunders at defensive tackle, and you needed to. Shai Tuttle, David Onyemata, they're out the door. Cam Jordan's back. Marcus Davenport, probably out the door, right? So you need another defensive end, and you need defensive tackle. Nathan Shepard and Colin Saunders starting for the New Orleans Saints, not that I just wouldn't call it an upgrade over David Onyemata and Shai Tuttle. I wouldn't call it an upgrade. Not that it's bad. I think those guys can absolutely step in and be quality players for the New Orleans Saints, but they're not to the same standard, at least I don't believe, of the two starters that you lost in free agency. So, yes, they're slated to just, as of right now, to slide in and start. Is that really your best option if you're the New Orleans Saints? Probably not. So that's probably a spot you really look at in the NFL draft right now is defensive tackle. Defensive line in general, because we mentioned Marcus Davenport too, right? And you would love for Peyton Turner to just slide right in there, but you just haven't seen him on the field enough. That's been a problem a lot for the New Orleans Saints, really as a team in general. We all remember all the injuries they went through last year, but specifically kind of in that defensive end spot opposite of Cam Jordan. You've liked guys you've had there. They just haven't been able to get on the field. And Peyton Turner, if it's not defensive end, he's a guy who's shown the versatility to be able to play the defensive tackle spot as well a little bit. So all of that, long story to say, CBS Sports today, they released, Josh Edwards released a comprehensive biggest need for each NFC team. And maybe we can revisit this a little bit later in the show and look at the rest of the NFC South. But for the New Orleans Saints, no surprise, he listed defensive tackle. And a couple others as well, just as secondary, linebacker, wide receiver, cornerback, which we can get to. But defensive tackle going in very much is the biggest need for the New Orleans Saints in the NFL draft right now, and that's even after adding Shepard and Saunders in free agency. And I would take it a step further, kind of like I just did there with Peyton Turner, and expand it to defensive line as a whole for the New Orleans Saints. You see a lot of mock drafts mocking an edge rusher to these Saints at pick number 29, whether it's Van Ness from Iowa or other guys around there. One I was looking at earlier had an edge rusher from Iowa State mocked to the New Orleans Saints. So this has defensive tackle. I would expand that into defensive line really as a whole, but I would expect the Saints to draft both actually at this point, defensive tackle and defensive line. Matt has sat up here, I don't know for how many weeks, joking, they had one defensive tackle under contract going into 23 before they signed Shepard and Saunders. So just bringing in those guys, that's not enough. DA in that cut says depth. Well, you need more. The other position CBS Sports looked at, linebacker, kind of touched on that a little bit, right? You like Demario Davis, you like Pete Werner, what you got behind them. I think you're probably looking more for a depth piece or a rotational body there. Wide receiver is absolutely a spot the Saints have to address here in the draft because kind of touched on it there a little bit. You love the idea of Michael Thomas and Chris Olave together. How much can you really count on that? Honestly, until that's one of those things, see it, you believe it when you see it type deals with Michael Thomas at this point. So you love the idea on paper. You absolutely have to, if for nothing else, address depth. You bring in Brian Edwards. That's great. There's a lot more though that left to be desired there for the New Orleans Saints in the wide receiver room. And then cornerback's the other one that they list. Dennis Allen today did, as we're talking about needs, have a bit of an interesting answer when he was asked kind of how the Saints approach the NFL draft. And he said it's not necessarily so much on a needs basis.
We go into these draft meetings and we try to grade the player based on, what we see, and not really based on what we might perceive as our needs. And so you don't want to artificially pump somebody up, because you have a need at a certain position. And so, again, I think I've said this. I like where we're at right now. I'm looking forward to this draft process and adding some pieces. But I like where our team is right now.
Interesting way to answer the question, where you can talk more about players than needs. But I mean, it's not like they just discount needs totally, right? I mean, the Saints know where their biggest needs are, and then I think they go in with an open mind. Is kind of what I took from that answer. Is they go with an open mind. They don't try to just zero in on one guy, and because they need defensive tackle so much, they're just going to build this guy up. They're going to go and evaluate each defensive tackle throughout the draft and grade them honestly and figure out the best player, the best fit for their system and whatnot. So look, it'll be interesting. Again, I'll put it at defensive line in general for the New Orleans Saints, both tackle and edge rusher, with wide receiver for me a close second for the New Orleans Saints. Is again about a month away from the NFL draft. Dennis Allen speaking at the NFL owners meetings.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact, and be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.